The Evolution of Meaning. A materialist analysis introduction. There is a compelling theory about human nature that goes like this. Humans are wired to believe in something bigger than themselves. Those who lack this belief are prone to depression. The need for meaning is not a cultural accident or a luxury of consciousness. It is an evolutionary adaptation, etched into our neural circuitry over hundreds of thousands of years. Our ancestors who could find pattern, purpose, and transcendence were the ones who endured. Those who fell into a hollow, meaningless void were gradually weeded out of the genetic line. The evidence for this theory is all around us. People believe in God, in karma, in the simulation hypothesis, in being a brain in a jar, in music, in gardening, in running marathons. The content changes, but the pattern remains constant. Humans need to believe. This theory is intuitive, compassionate, and partly correct. It recognizes something real about the human condition. The need for meaning is not a weakness, but a profound part of who we are. And yet, as with any theory that claims to explain human behavior through biology alone, it leaves out the most important part of the story. It tells us that humans need meaning, but it does not ask why so many people in modern society find meaning so hard to come by. It tells us that belief protects against depression, but it does not ask what kind of society produces depression on a mass scale. It tells us to go find a belief, but it does not ask whether the available beliefs are adequate to the depth of the crisis we face. This is the limitation of any purely evolutionary explanation of human behavior. It is not that evolution is irrelevant, but that it tells only a small part of the story. Evolution gave us the capacity for meaning, but it did not determine the social forms that meaning would take, nor did it predict the systematic destruction of those forms under capitalism. By framing the problem as a mismatch between ancient brains and modern environments, it obscures the fact that the modern environment was not randomly generated. It was created by a specific economic system with specific priorities, and that system has systematically destroyed the sources of collective meaning that humans have relied on for most of our history. The theory itself is a product of the same historical moment it attempts to explain. It arose in a time of widespread meaninglessness, and it makes sense of that experience by locating the problem in the eternal nature of the human brain rather than in the specific features of the present. This is not accidental. Theories that naturalize the existing order are always more comfortable than theories that challenge it. They tell us that things are as they must be, not as they have been made to be. It accepts the premise that humans need meaning but insists that this need cannot be understood in isolation from the social conditions under which it is either satisfied or frustrated. It argues that the meaning crisis of modern society is not a crisis of individual belief, but a crisis of social organization. And it suggests that the cure for despair is not a private belief, but a shared struggle. The meaning that saves us is not the meaning we find alone in our heads. It is the meaning we build together, in solidarity with others, in the collective project of creating a world where everyone's need for meaning can be satisfied. Part 1. What the theory gets right. Let us begin by acknowledging the strengths of this theory, because they are real. It correctly identifies that humans have a deep need for meaning, purpose, and transcendence. This is not a controversial claim. Every society in human history has had some form of belief system, some story about why we are here and what our lives mean. The universality of this phenomenon suggests that it is not merely a cultural invention, but something rooted in our nature as social beings. The theory is also right to broaden the definition of belief beyond organized religion. The technologist who believes in the simulation hypothesis has constructed a framework for existence that provides order and purpose. The musician who finds transcendence in sound has built a relationship with something larger than the ego. The gardener who connects to the cycle of seasons has found meaning in the natural world. The marathon runner who discovers spiritual transcendence in physical exhaustion has created a practice of devotion. These are not lesser forms of belief. They are expressions of the same human need, adapted to a secular age. The evolutionary argument is plausible as far as it goes. The human brain is a pattern-finding machine, honed by millions of years of natural selection. Ancestors who could find meaning in suffering, who could cooperate around shared beliefs, and who could maintain motivation in the face of hardship would indeed have had significant survival advantages. The ability to construct narratives of purpose is a real human capacity, shaped by the pressures of our evolutionary history. But this capacity, like any biological capacity, requires the right environmental conditions to develop. A seed has the capacity to become a tree, but without soil, water, and sunlight, that capacity remains unrealized. The same is true of the human capacity for meaning. The theory also correctly observes the link between meaning and mental health. The absence of a coherent belief system does correlate with depression and despair. This is a genuine phenomenon that any serious analysis must account for. The question is whether this correlation is best explained by individual biology or by social conditions. But here's where the theory must go deeper. The fact that humans have a capacity for meaning does not tell us what conditions allow that capacity to flourish, nor what conditions systematically frustrate it. A seed has the capacity to grow into a tree, but that capacity is meaningless without soil, water, and sunlight. Similarly, the human capacity for meaning is meaningless without the social conditions that allow it to develop. Part 2. The problem of naturalizing the present. The most significant flaw in the evolutionary theory of belief is that it naturalizes the present. By telling a story about ancient brains and universal human needs, it makes the current social order appear inevitable. It says, humans need meaning, and the current distribution of meaning and meaninglessness is simply the result of individuals succeeding or failing to find beliefs that work for them. This obscures the most important fact about meaning in modern society. Meaning is unequally distributed. And it is unequally distributed not because some people are better at finding it than others, but because the conditions that make meaning possible are themselves unequally distributed. Consider what is required for a person to find and sustain a meaningful belief system. It requires time to reflect and explore. It requires energy to engage in practices of meaning making. It requires cognitive bandwidth to question and construct frameworks of understanding. It requires access to communities of shared practice where beliefs can be tested and reinforced. It requires the freedom to experiment with different frameworks and the security to fail without catastrophic consequences. These conditions are not equally available to everyone. They are distributed along class lines, along lines of race, along lines of gender. The single mother working 2 jobs does not have the time to meditate on the simulation hypothesis. The warehouse worker whose body is broken by 12-hour shifts does not have the energy to cultivate a spiritual practice. The young person crushed by student debt and housing precarity does not have the security to explore different philosophies of life. The person who cannot afford therapy, cannot afford a hobby that requires equipment, cannot afford the downtime to find themselves. For them, the prescription to go find a belief sounds less like compassionate advice and more like a taunt from privilege. This is the class dimension that evolutionary psychology systematically ignores. By telling a story about universal human nature, it erases the massive differences in life experience that are produced by one's position in the economic hierarchy. The need for meaning may be universal, but the ability to satisfy that need is not. And any theory that fails to account for this inequality is not just incomplete. It is actively misleading because it blames individuals for failing to solve a problem that is systemic in origin. Part 3. The destruction of collective meaning. The evolutionary theory presents belief as a private matter. You find your belief, God, simulation, guitar, garden, and you hold it in your individual consciousness. This is a profoundly modern and individualistic understanding of meaning that would be unrecognizable to most humans who have ever lived. For the vast majority of human history, meaning was not private. It was woven into the fabric of collective life. Your work had visible purpose. You could see the food you grew, the house you built, the community you sustained through your labor. Your relationships were stable and long-term. You knew the same people your whole life, and your role in the community was clear to everyone. Your beliefs were not something you chose from a menu of options. They were the air you breathed, shared with everyone around you. The rituals of daily life, the cycles of the seasons, the stories told around the fire, the festivals that marked the passage of time, all of these were collective, not individual, experiences of meaning. Capitalism destroyed this. It was not an accident. It was not a side effect. The destruction of collective meaning was a necessary precondition for the creation of a labor force that could be bought, sold, and moved wherever capital needed it. The Industrial Revolution tore people from their land and packed them into factories. It turned skilled craftspeople who took pride in their work into interchangeable machine operators whose only relationship to their labor was the wage it brought. It transformed stable communities that had existed for generations into fluid labor markets where people moved wherever capital required them. And it subjected every sphere of life to the logic of the market, including meaning itself. The results were devastating and deliberate. Work became alienated. You no longer owned the product of your labor or controlled the conditions under which you performed it. Your work became something you did for someone else, on someone else's schedule, according to someone else's priorities. The visible connection between effort and outcome was severed. Community became fragmented. You no longer lived among the same people your whole life, sharing rituals and responsibilities and a common fate. Instead, you moved where the jobs were, leaving behind the networks of mutual support that had sustained your ancestors. Belief became privatized. You no longer participated in a shared understanding of the world that was reinforced by daily rituals and community practices. You were expected to construct your own personal meaning system from the available consumer options, like choosing a brand of cereal from a supermarket shelf. And just as with cereal, the options available to you were determined not by what you needed, but by what was profitable to produce. This is the true source of the meaning crisis that the evolutionary theory identifies but misattributes. It is not that modern people have rationally concluded that life is meaningless and bravely accepted the void. It is that the economic system has systematically dismantled the social structures that once provided meaning as a natural byproduct of daily life. Part 4. The commodification of belief. The evolutionary theory lists the available beliefs as if they are all equally valid responses to the human need for meaning. Religion, simulation hypothesis, brain in a jar, guitar, gardening, running marathons. These are presented as equivalent options on a menu of transcendence, waiting for the individual to choose whichever one suits their taste. But they are not equivalent. They exist in a hierarchy that is shaped by the same forces that shape everything else in a market society. And the beliefs that are most available, most encouraged, and most socially acceptable are precisely those that do not threaten the existing order. Consider what each of these beliefs actually does in practice. Religion that focuses on personal salvation rather than social justice directs your energy inward toward individual piety rather than outward toward collective change. The simulation hypothesis tells you that nothing is ultimately real, so there is no point trying to change the world because it is just a computation running on a cosmic server. This is not just a harmless thought experiment. It is a deeply political belief that encourages passivity in the face of real suffering. If the world is not real, then poverty is not real. If poverty is not real, then there is no moral imperative to end it. The simulation hypothesis, for all its intellectual sophistication, functions to reconcile its believers to the existing order by denying that order's reality. The brain in a jar fantasy transforms legitimate political despair into a metaphysical narrative about the nature of reality itself. Hobbies absorb your creative and emotional energy into individual pursuits that leave the structures of the world completely unchanged. Each of these beliefs functions as a pressure valve, a carefully managed release of the discontent that would otherwise build up and threaten the system. The hobbyist who finds meaning in their craft is not wrong to do so, but the framing that this is the best available form of meaning obscures the fact that the same creative energy, organized collectively, could transform the conditions that make work meaningless in the first place. The gardener who finds transcendence in the soil is not mistaken, but the privatization of that meaning into a solitary weekend activity prevents it from becoming the basis for a shared project of ecological transformation. They give you just enough meaning to keep going, just enough purpose to stay productive, just enough transcendence to accept your circumstances, without ever threatening the structures that produce the emptiness in the first place. You can believe in God and still accept exploitation. You can believe in the simulation and still vote for the same politicians who serve corporate interests. You can pour your soul into your guitar and still pay rent to a landlord who owns multiple properties while you can barely afford your single room. This is not an accident of the marketplace of ideas. It is a feature of a society that has commodified everything, including meaning. The beliefs that are most available are the ones that can be safely consumed as private goods without disrupting the social order. The beliefs that are discouraged, marginalized, ridiculed, or actively suppressed are those that would lead people to question the system itself. What belief system is most conspicuously absent from the theory's list of options? The belief that ordinary people, organized together, can collectively change the conditions of their existence. The belief that the world does not have to be this way, and that we have the power to make it different. This is the one belief that the system cannot tolerate, because it is the one belief that leads to action rather than acceptance. Part 5. The political economy of despair. The evolutionary theory is correct that rising rates of depression and anxiety are a significant signal that something is deeply wrong, but it misreads the signal. It sees individuals failing to find beliefs. What it should see is a system that produces despair as a predictable and rational outcome. Consider the evidence. Rates of depression and anxiety have been rising across the developed world for decades, with some estimates showing a 50% increase in the last 20 years alone. This is not a blip or a statistical artifact. It is a sustained trend that has accelerated in recent years, correlating with major economic crises and political upheavals. This is not a blip or a statistical artifact. It is a sustained trend that has accelerated in recent years. This increase is concentrated among young people, who face a future of precarity and decline. It is concentrated among the working class, who bear the brunt of economic insecurity. And it correlates strongly with measures of social isolation, economic precarity, and a deteriorating outlook for the future. These are not random individuals who happen to be born without the belief gene, as the evolutionary theory might suggest. They are not failing to find meaning because of some personal deficiency. They are responding to objective conditions that would test the resilience of any human being. These are people responding to real and worsening material conditions. The question is not why so many people are depressed. The question is why the evolutionary theory attributes this to a failure of individual belief rather than to the conditions that produce despair. What are those conditions? Work that has been stripped of meaning and security, the gig economy, the erosion of benefits, the constant threat of replacement, communities that have been fragmented by geographic mobility and economic pressure. People move where the jobs are, leaving behind the networks of support that previous generations took for granted. Social connections that have been replaced by marketized substitutes, dating apps instead of community gatherings, social media instead of neighborhoods, therapy instead of solidarity, and a future that, for the first time in modern history, looks worse than the present. Climate crisis accelerating, housing costs rising faster than wages, student debt crushing an entire generation, inequality reaching levels not seen in a century. When your work is meaningless, your community is fragmented, your social connections are mediated by corporations, and your future looks bleak, the real question is not why so many people are depressed. The real question is why everyone is not depressed. The evolutionary theory reverses cause and effect in a way that serves the existing order. It says people are depressed because they lack belief as an individual failing. But the truth is that people lack belief because the system has systematically destroyed the conditions under which meaningful belief can take root. The depression is not a failure of individual psychology or evolutionary adaptation. It is a rational response to a world that offers no collective future. Part 6. What counts as something bigger? The theory's central concept is belief in something bigger than yourself. This is the key insight, and it deserves to be taken seriously. Humans do need to feel part of something that transcends their individual existence. The question is what counts as something bigger, and what happens when the available options are inadequate. The theory lists God, simulation, brain in a jar, hobbies. These are presented as equally valid paths to transcendence, but they share a crucial characteristic. They are all individual forms of belief. They do not require you to organize with other people. They do not require you to challenge the existing order. They do not require you to imagine a different world and fight for it. What the theory leaves out is the most powerful source of transcendent meaning in human history: collective struggle for a better world. Throughout history, the people who have shown the greatest resilience in the face of overwhelming suffering are not those who retreated into private belief, but those who organized with others to change their conditions. Consider the labor movement of the early 20th century. Workers who faced brutal exploitation, dangerous conditions, and the constant threat of starvation did not find meaning in the simulation hypothesis. They found meaning in organizing unions, in walking picket lines, in building a movement that could challenge the power of capital. They found meaning in the belief that their struggle, even if it did not succeed in their lifetime, was part of a larger story of human liberation. Consider the civil rights movement. People who faced state-sanctioned violence, legal discrimination, and systematic exclusion did not find meaning in a private spiritual practice. They found meaning in mass meetings, in freedom rides, in the collective project of building a different America. What made these forms of meaning more powerful than private belief? They offered something that private belief cannot. They offered a diagnosis of why things were wrong, not random suffering or inevitable fate, but systematic injustice produced by identifiable forces. They offered a vision of what could be different, not an escape into another world, but a transformed society here and now. They offered a method for getting there, not passive faith or individual effort, but collective action. And they offered a community of fellow travelers, people who shared your struggle, your hope, and your risk. This is something bigger in the most literal sense. It is not bigger than you in the way God is bigger, abstract, distant, mysterious, and ultimately unknowable. It is bigger in the most concrete way possible. It involves other people. Your purpose is not private. It is shared. Your struggle is not individual. It is collective. Your hope is not based on faith in an afterlife or a simulation, but on the tangible possibility of a transformed world, built together with others. The evolutionary theory excludes this possibility not because it is invalid as a source of meaning, but because it is dangerous to the system that the theory implicitly accepts. A population that believes in God can be governed. A population that believes in their guitar can be managed. A population that believes in their collective power to change society cannot be controlled. Part 7. The prescription theory ends with a prescription. Go find a belief to commit to. It does not matter what. God, simulation, brain in a jar, guitar, garden. Just find something. Your brain evolved to need meaning. Provide it with one. The alternative is the silence of the void, which will inevitably start to sound like despair. This advice is genuine and compassionate. It recognizes the human need for meaning and offers a path forward that is accessible to anyone. But it is fundamentally, perhaps fatally, individualistic. It places the entire burden on the suffering person to solve a problem that is social in nature. It tells the individual to fix themselves when what needs fixing is the world around them. Consider the implications of this prescription in practice. It is not just inadequate. It is actively harmful, because it redirects legitimate anger and despair away from the system that produces them and toward the individual who suffers them. It tells the warehouse worker that his despair is caused by his failure to find a meaningful belief, not by the 12-hour shifts, the lack of benefits, the constant threat of injury, and the knowledge that he will be replaced the moment he becomes too slow. It tells the young person drowning in debt that her anxiety is a failure of meaning-making, not a rational response to a system that has made housing, education, and healthcare unaffordable. It tells the isolated and lonely that their emptiness is a problem of individual belief, not a predictable consequence of a society that has destroyed community and commodified human connection. It tells the alienated worker that his dissatisfaction is spiritual rather than material, personal rather than political. This redirection of attention from systemic causes to individual symptoms is not just a theoretical error. It serves a real function in maintaining the existing order, not a predictable consequence of a society that has destroyed community and commodified human connection. A proper analysis would offer a very different prescription. Not find a private belief in the privacy of your own consciousness, but find other people who feel the same emptiness and ask why together. Not accept the available menu of commodified beliefs, but question why the menu is so limited and who benefits from keeping it that way. Not accommodate yourself to a system that produces despair as a byproduct, but organize to change that system. Not build a personal philosophy, but build collective power to change the conditions that produce despair. Not accept the simulation, but refuse the system that treats you as a replaceable part in a machine designed to extract profit from your labor and your life. The evolutionary drive for meaning is real. Your theory is right about that. But the meaning that heals is not found in private belief. It is found in shared struggle. The something bigger that our ancestors needed to survive was not a concept. It was a tribe. And the something bigger that we need today is not a belief. It is a movement. Conclusion: the evolutionary theory of belief asks the right question. It identifies the human need for meaning as a deep and genuine part of our nature. It recognizes that the absence of meaning leads to despair. And it offers a compassionate prescription for those who find themselves lost in the gray fog of meaninglessness. For these insights, it deserves to be taken seriously. But it stops short of the most important truth. It tells us what we need, but not why so many of us cannot get it. It identifies a universal human need, but ignores the social conditions that systematically frustrate that need for millions of people. It offers individual solutions to what are, in fact, collective problems. The truth is that the meaning crisis of modern society is not a crisis of individual belief. It is a crisis of social organization. The system that governs our lives has systematically destroyed the sources of collective meaning that humans have relied on for millennia. It has turned meaningful work into alienated labor performed for someone else's profit. It has turned stable communities into fluid markets where human relationships are subordinate to economic forces. It has turned shared beliefs into private consumption choices to be selected from a menu. And it has turned collective hope into individual therapy. The answer to this crisis is not to try harder to find a private belief. It is to recognize that the problem is not in our heads, but in our world. It is to find each other, to organize, and to build the power to transform the conditions under which we live. The something bigger that we need is not a belief. It is each other. The evolutionary inheritance is real. The human need for meaning is real. But so is the social system that systematically frustrates that need for the majority of people. And until we address both the biological need and the economic system that starves it, that systematically dismantles every source of collective meaning that previous generations relied upon, that commodifies even our search for transcendence into a consumer choice, we will continue to see rising rates of despair, no matter how many individuals find their guitar, their garden, or their simulation to believe in. The void is not inside us. The evolutionary theory is wrong about that. The void has been created around us by a system that tore apart every structure of shared meaning that our ancestors built. And it can only be filled together, not through private belief, not through individual spirituality.